On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Where shall we celebrate the Passover?" So begins the Passion narrative in Matthew's Gospel, often called the greatest story ever told. This year, we will read the Passion story 4 times in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and inevitably we will read it out of season. So even though it's a beautifully sunny day and we're looking forward to summer and we're about to celebrate Pentecost, we will be going back to the events that we usually read about in Holy Week and at Easter: the Passion, the death, the suffering of Jesus, and his eventual resurrection. Before we launch into these stories, I thought it would be helpful just to note 3 things. And of course, there's lots of things we could talk about with the Passion stories. They've occupied Christian thought for 2,000 years. But I'd just like to concentrate on 3 things. First, note how much the stories have in common in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, even though those gospel writers present the life of Jesus in different ways, lots of similarities, but they present them in different ways, the Passion narratives, the cycle of Passion stories, are remarkably similar. And scholars have always noted this and have believed that this was because these stories were told and retold from the very first days after they happened, and that Christians treasured and preserved these stories and told them to one another and told them to their children and corrected one another and added in details. And so was created this wonderful cycle of stories that is so full of detail, of exact times and dates, of people. And note how many names are mentioned in these passages, names that were clearly important to the early church and people who were remembered. And when we see, we'll read it once first in Matthew, and then we go to Mark, and then Luke, and then John, and you will see how similar these stories are, and how that same basic structure is always there, beginning with the Last Supper, then going on to Gethsemane, then to the betrayal, then the trial, then the crucifixion, then the resurrection. And so we can see that this is an incredibly trustworthy part of our scriptures, a story that was treasured and preserved long before it was written down. Second, having said that, note some of the differences in the Gospels and the different emphases that the Gospel writers bring. So there are little stories and little incidents that are unique to each of the Gospel narratives. So in Matthew, look out for Pilate's wife and the dream she has, and look out for Pilate washing his hands. That's something we don't find in the other Gospel narratives. And because we usually put all those stories together when we tell the story of Holy Week and Easter, it's interesting just to note those differences and how the evangelists would have had slightly different sources of information, different people they would have spoken to. Also note in Matthew the great emphasis on the fulfillment of Scripture, how this terrible thing that is happening, that Christians still find so hard to understand, was all part of the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. And Matthew, as we've seen in his Gospel, a man deeply embedded in his Scriptures, is so keen to show us that what happened, we can see it in earlier texts. And conversely, when we read some of those texts like Psalms and Isaiah, books or passages we think we might not know, actually we will recognize them because of the allusions to them in the Gospel, especially Isaiah and Psalms. Third and finally, note how important these stories were to the evangelists and to the early church. We'll see this especially in Mark, where the Passion narrative takes up almost half of the book. But even in Matthew, when Matthew is describing all the things that Jesus did, all the things he said, all his teaching, all the people he encountered, this story, which takes place over a few days, occupies a huge amount of space within his writings. And this demonstrates how important this narrative was to Matthew, to the church he served, and to us. This was the central story, the early church believed, that explained everything. Far more important than Christmas or any of the other events in Jesus' life, really. This was the central narrative. This was the narrative they taught to one another. This was the narrative that Paul continually reflects upon. And note that it is a story that continues to speak to every age. A story of an innocent man suffering for sins he did not commit, of corrupt rulers, of a fickle crowd. And as we read them, try to read with fresh eyes. Read them with your own insight of where you're coming from. Read them with the insight of the world in which we live. And I hope and pray that you will see again for yourselves, each time we read it, something fresh, something new. And you will see the incredible power of this story, the Passion story, a story of love, of God's love for us, made real in Jesus Christ.